Shall we begin?
We shall. Welcome to Avocado Inc., where we say mildly controversial things, but not because we want them to be controversial, but because we think that they're significant.
And philosophy's controversial.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Just in general.
That's a good point. We fixed many things in our technological setup. Hopefully this will be a large improvement. And hopefully I can speak clearly
And into the mic.
Alrighty, okay. So the first thing we wanted to raise some hackles about was an idea of faith as an epistemological source, or as a source of knowledge, and maybe just problematize that a little bit for you, because why not? I think you can just get a grasp of what we're trying to get at by using the example that we grew up with, which is the Book of Mormon. So in Moroni, in the Book of Mormon, you get a claim at the end of the book that if you read the book and pray with a sincere heart, you will gain a knowledge that it's basically from God. Now, the interesting thing is that first, epistemological claims where you say, look, do a particular thing and you're going to gain a particular kind of knowledge, or the sort of claims where specificity is it. That this is the most important thing. Nothing is more important than the specificity. An example, if I punch the table and my hand hurts, it's important that I don't just say, I know that if I punch a table, I will hurt. Because that's actually not technically true. That I can't make that statement because there's too many ways in which me is not my hand, if that makes sense. And although, if you going down to the grit too much in every instance of a knowledge claim can get really complicated, it's still worth pointing out that it's different to say my hand hurts versus I hurt. And this is important in a claim like what the Book of Mormon makes, for instance, because what does it actually mean for Moroni to say what he says? Well, there's probably I don't know how many different ways of interpreting it, but here's a couple. One is this Moroni guy is, if we take him to be who he is, right? He's this prophet at the end of a civilization, and he's basically compiled this record, and he's like, look, if you pray to God and ask about this record, the record is, it can be confirmed that the record is holy. Which is confusing because I don't think he, as an historian, would try to make the claim, and this might just be me putting stuff in his mouth, but it doesn't seem like he as a historian would be trying to make the claim that everything in the book was 100% true.
Yeah.
Because that would be a really weird claim to make, right?
Especially as a historian who was actively abridging things.
Exactly.
So
what was his claim? And I think this is the first point where you got to stop and think, what does it mean? The Mormon missionary comes to you, they say, look, read it. If you feel the burning in your heart, then, and the statement that they make after then is really the only important statement that's being made in all of that, because it matters what it is, what knowledge you're specifically getting out of a particular experience. And one of the greatest problems with faith-based epistemology is the specificity. You don't actually know what it is that's being confirmed. If I pray about the Book of Mormon, do I know that as the classic LDS phrase goes, I know the Book of Mormon is true, is so wildly unspecific on purpose because it requires no kind of proof to it. If you just say it's true, then that just kind of means a general good and of God, and it doesn't even necessarily mean perfect. It just means
this is the wild thing, is that especially if you start reading literature written by people who are on the what we might call the edge of the Mormon experience when it comes to like truth claims. They like whether or not they believe things to be you know as we were taught them to be. If you talk to those people, a lot of them will be like, yeah, no, I still feel like I read the Book of Mormon and had that verification. But then they're like, but I don't think the Book of Mormon is actually a true account. And you're like, what do you mean? And they're like, oh well, no, I just feel like it's full of good like truths and stuff. And you're like, the difference between those, I hope, is obvious.
And should be a big deal epistemologically. Like, what doesn't it matter whether you can know, or that one person believes that they know that the Book of Mormon is basically perfect, and another person, by the same self-ascribed process, claims to believe to know, basically anything else about the Book of Mormon. Now, that's one problem. And so I'll just leave you to chew on that for a little bit. I will throw out the one potential apologetic response to this, but I don't mean apologetic as in just like trying to dismiss that. I just mean apologetic is a defense of the faith. So the apologetic response to that, I think it would just be you need to be more specific in your prayers. Because I think people have said this to me in the past, at least, that you shouldn't just be asking, is it true? Although I've also heard that, but you should be asking, like, is this from God, or, whatever other specific answer you want. Now, I think that's actually excellent. And as far as the epistemological process goes, it's far more responsible, right? Mm-hmm. Because you feel like that's actually testable. You can say, I'm going to ask a specific question, and if I get the requisite answer, great. Now, here's the problem. The other issue is, what is the requisite answer? Okay, so if I hit my hand on the table, to reuse my last example, the requisite answer to my epistemological question of throwing my hand is the pain that I get. So to say that I know that my hand will hurt if I hit the table is a direct correlate, because what is it that I know? I know the pain, and the pain is the direct thing that I get. Okay, so it's like a one-to-one, at least as close as we can get. There's a huge problem with faith in that I ask, is this true, or is this from God? And I do not have access in a fundamental way to what I need to be able to put that in a one-to-one correlation. Take, for instance, the God question. Is God real? I'm just praying. I say, are you real? Most people, when they say they receive a faith-based knowledge that the answer is yes, will refer to some other feeling or experience besides God himself or herself, or whatever God is, as the evidence, the requisite evidence. The pain that's shooting up my arm is something that's not the God. So I say, is God real? I get a warm, fuzzy feeling. Mm-hmm. The warm, fuzzy feeling, how do I know that that is a direct correlate to the God question? And I think that's the strongest way I can problematize it, is by pointing out that there's an asymmetry between those two. Whereas before, I used the word pain to denote the feeling of pain. Mm-hmm. But the word God is not wrapped up in any significant way in the warm, fuzzy feeling. And so the claim that is, if somebody tells me, look, if you have the warm, fuzzy feeling, that's confirmation from God, that's just them telling me that. In other words, I have to take that statement on faith. I have to make an act of faith to draw a connection in an epistemological sense between a question that I might ask and a faith-based answer.
So this is the really easy way to illustrate why this is significant and what it looks like in real life. Go find someone who was a devout member and then left, and ask them if they now deny whether or not they had fuzzy feelings. Like, they'll tell you that they had the exact same experience. What changes is this very thing, which is they'll say it wasn't God, or it wasn't God as I knew it. It was something else. Maybe it was energy. I don't care what you want to explain it as, even if it's just psychology. But the point is that because it's not a one-to-one, the fuzzy feeling isn't God, that actually isn't a solid proof in any way. It doesn't give you knowledge in that sense, because it can be just as easily described as something else, and in fact is by everyone who is no longer a part of the group.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And that happened to me. That happened to my brother. My brother left the church before I did, and that was one of the first things he told me, was the idea that, well, it's not like I stopped having the fuzzy feeling, but I don't think that the fuzzy feeling was God anymore. And the more that I tested it, the less it made any sense, because he started like paying really close attention. And this one really struck me, that he was like, I started noticing that I was having an indistinguishable fuzzy feeling in situations that, according to the gospel, I should not be having this feeling. It did not make sense. And then I paid really close attention. One of the things that really got me in the end was that I felt this really fuzzy feeling when I was doing gay stuff.
That's what I was gonna say. I was like making out with a guy, and you're like, "Wow, God, is this you?"
Yeah.
Now,
so-
I want to interject here, because the temptation, and maybe I shouldn't call it temptation because there's negative connotation there, but what you're gonna feel like you want to say, if you disagree with us here, is you're gonna want to be like, well, what you're experiencing is different from what I'm experiencing, and you might even go as far to say that what you have been experiencing this whole time is different than what I'm experiencing when I pray to God. Number one, I think if we were to sit down and try and explain our experiences, there's no way you could actually illustrate that through words, which I think is a significant issue for like navigating this space, which basically what it entails is that your claim is not something that can be taken seriously in conversation. Not that it couldn't possibly be true, but that can't be taken seriously because we can't actually illustrate whether or not it's true. But then also, just a reference, throwback to our last episode where we talked about this very issue, where the particular beliefs that you have bring you to this place where you actually tell people that what they're saying is not true solely on the fact that it doesn't fit with what you think, which I don't think is responsible for communication. I don't think it's fair, but just want to throw that out there.
Yeah. And I know some people are still going to die on that rock, which, you can do. But I think Hash makes a very good point that it's really hard to talk about knowledge if you try to make the special access claim, which is that I'm having a different kind of experience than you. The fuzzy feeling that I have felt in very gay situations isn't actually the fuzzy feeling that I was feeling in the religious situations, or something along those lines, right? But that leaves you in a position where you can't communicate. It's as if you basically just said, I'm a different kind of being. It's like I'm no longer human in a certain sense, or we're different kinds of humans, right? Because fundamental to our being able to interact as people is the assumption that we share fundamental experiences. Otherwise, there's
usually ones that we can communicate.
Yeah.
Through this type of thing.
But yeah, anyway, I'll throw out perhaps, just because pointing out the other side of things can be helpful. I'll throw out perhaps the other apologetic that I've heard on this front is that the disconnect that I've been talking about between the question that you might ask and the requisite answer, and actually believing that those are necessarily connected. It comes from somebody close to me that I talked with about this for a long time ago. And their response was that God is capable of giving someone knowledge and taking it away.
Just planted it in there.
Yeah. So in other words, it's not that we're different kinds of beings, but that if your heart is actually open, then God can can implant the knowledge that makes that connection real.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you lose, your openness and willingness, then God will just remove that. And so you're no longer able to remember even that it was connected in the first place.
Mm-hmm. There are a few issues with this particular position. You're better at explaining this, but we've had this conversation before.
There are lots of problems with that. First off, if God's like putting knowledge in us and removing knowledge, then like it doesn't matter whether you have the knowledge or you don't have the knowledge, because your responsibility as an epistemic agent is removed either way, because you just know, right? If you're in the know, then you know. And if you're not in the know, I was literally, like somebody like me, where they're trying to say like, you don't even remember that you used to know, which is a bizarre statement. But if you take that for what it's worth, then that means that I can't be held responsible for taking my own feelings seriously. So it's perfectly responsible for me to say, well, yeah, I don't know, and I never knew. And it's perfectly responsible for the other person to say, yes, I know, and I've always known.
Yeah, once again, the statements become useless because there's totally no way to actually illustrate them in conversation or like use them for something. Like you saying and me saying we don't know, or like literally have the same epistemic value.
Yeah. And so even if that's true, I'll just grant it, it's fine, cool. Then that means that I don't think God could judge either of us. I don't think that he could judge you for taking that knowledge seriously if you were to make that claim. I'm just pointing at the random viewer, sorry, I want to call you out. But he couldn't judge me either, because it would be perfectly responsible for me to take my feelings at face value. And because of that, because by and large, faith claims are directly connected to an agent morality, where it's all centered around a being who has epistemic stuff available to them to be able to come to the truth and choose the right thing. That necessitates that all epistemic agents have equal access to knowledge. So in other words, that cannot be the case. That apologetic just falls apart in the face of everything else, unless of course you want to just change the whole moral thing and be a Calvinist. I guess this is Calvinism. Yeah.
Okay. This sets me up really nicely to kind of talk about why I ended up leaving, like what eventually prompted me in that direction, which I mean there's a lot there, and so this is going to be a little bit of a short summary, but what it was that first off, I was really invested. I wanted to have a stronger relationship, and believe it or not, more of a dependency on God. And part of that I realized was that if what I was praying about or asking about wasn't specific, I didn't feel like I was actually depending on God, because I could always interpret it in whatever way I wanted to, which meant that like God didn't end up being actually a big force in my life, because it didn't matter what he said. I just interpreted it how I wanted to. So the answer for me was to end up doing this thing, which was be more specific about what I was asking for. And I knew that brought some like dangers with it, because that's like, it's hard to be specific in a way that's careful. And so like I worked really hard at that, and eventually got to the point where I felt like I could outline very specific things that God was telling me. And then I tried to test them, and they weren't true. So, and I mean, you're probably like, well, what was it? You want content, and we could talk about it all day. But the point was that afterwards, after I got to this point where I was like, look, I feel like I received something specific, and I feel like it ended up not being true. I would talk to people about this. I was absolutely destroyed. But in talking to people, their solution was to try and reinsert vagueness into the specificity.
Yeah.
To say, well, maybe you didn't understand him, or maybe you didn't even understand yourself when you asked these questions. And like, the push was always to be like, recede into that vagueness where you can't see an issue. And I don't necessarily, I can't say that like that is like the wrong approach to making this work. It was the only one that would have kept me in the church. So however you want to measure that out, but the point is that there's this really interesting conflict between being specific to actually make these things meaningful and actually get like real knowledge out of experiences, and being vague so that they work. I don't know if you have more to say on that, but
that was well put. Yeah. It's a huge problem, and I would bet money, not that I am a betting man, but I would bet money that people, if they were more specific in their epistemological approach to religion, that would directly correlate to them losing their faith. And that might be a little bit harsh, but I just don't think the testing holds out. The fact of the matter is, the more you pursue it, the more you realize that it's just, if the system that you've been given should be a testable system.
Yeah.
And I'm not, okay, I should clarify here. This is important. When we are talking about testable, we're not meaning like, God, show me where my lost keys are. If you don't show me where the lost keys are,
you're not real.
You're not real. Because everyone is aware of why that is protected under this system. Because God has a will. Fine. The keys aren't necessary to your salvation or anything. There's just no need for you to be able to control the mind of God, right? Mm-hmm. That is not what we mean. What we're talking about are access to truth that is supposedly necessary for salvation. Doesn't matter what religion you want to give. They all seem to have these sorts of things. So that is the truth itself we're trying to point out. If you make it specific enough that it's actually a truth, it falls apart. Mm-hmm. And if you keep it vague enough that I don't know how you could actually call that a truth, the sort of statement like, I know the church is true, to use LDS parlance, that means literally nothing. Once you get the specifics, you'll find, and then take those specifics seriously. For instance, here's an example. I say, I know the church is true. That's something that just is vague enough, it works. But if I break that down into its parts, it might mean, I know that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon, not that he just made it up. Or maybe I know that the prophets speak for God on earth. Now those, you might be like, well, yeah, that's what I meant the whole time. But I don't think it is, because we've been trying to point out this hot potato approach, which is that if you take any of those specific claims seriously and really look at them and say, do I know that this is true? I'm pretty sure you're not going to find yourself on as solid ground as you thought you would. And that's because you're not actually looking at the specific truth claims. At least this, I think this is how most people would describe it. You're not looking at them individually and saying each is true or not true. You're saying, I know the church is true, as a vague way of representing that there's always something that I can find my footing on. If I lose my footing on something else, then I'm going to be able to find it somewhere else, right? Because there are plenty of instances where I'm pretty sure anybody could push you to be able to say, well, yeah, prophets don't always speak for God. It doesn't matter if you try to make the distinction of sometimes they speak as men, because anywhere you try to draw the line, there's going to be some exception. And there's so many people who have illustrated this beautifully in so many different ways. So hopefully that clarification makes sense. I feel like that was important.
Yeah. I think this is a little bit. I'll just do it. Anyways, my suggestion to you, and I would like you to just consider how similar this might sound to some things you've heard in General Conference. I would ask yourself, how much do you actually trust this system or God, this faith thing, and to actually put some weight on it, and to like tell yourself, you know what? Like, we'll ask the question: if God were to tell me something specific, or like actually direct me in a way that I couldn't get the direction somewhere else, if he were to be the real source of some knowledge in my life, would I run with that and then try and test that out? Like, give God the opportunity to have an impact in your life that is specific. Follow through with it. I would love to see where it goes.
Yep. Because what most people are doing right now is not doing anything.
Yeah.
There's no direct action that actually correlates to a specific piece of knowledge. And the actions that you are taking aren't faith related, not necessarily, because something like tithing is a good example. Tithing is the sort of the blessings that are supposed to come from something like tithing are purposefully non-specific. You can't say, I know that I'm getting the blessings that I want from tithing, because the blessings that you're supposed to get from tithing are like this vague, like stability and overall satisfaction with certain things. But in other words, there are claims that should be specific in and of themselves and should have specific outcomes. In fact, this is how somebody like Joseph Smith himself operated on a consistent basis. He worked with specific claims that were supposed to have specific outcomes, and they failed all the time. And we have largely just kind of ignored the fact that that happened, and we've just taken ourselves away from that approach in general because it's not epistemologically safe. Because if you come face to face with that, then there's nothing you can do. You have to then challenge the connection that you see between what kind of confirmation you're getting for any particular question. And you just see that those aren't, you're just taking those to be connected. It's an act of faith itself to believe that you're getting an answer to any particular faith-based question. Yeah. So, hopefully we didn't ruin your day. That wasn't the point. But I definitely think it's worth talking about.
Yeah. Did we want to move on to something else?
Let's do it. The minor problem.
Let's do it.
Why not? Let's just get some more snakes angry.
This is, you know what? Actually, I have something. Oh, it's on my phone, and we're using it to film. But
okay.
But I will just, give us a short summary. I have posted some stuff about trans rights and minors' trans rights on my story, and I've gotten a lot of interesting responses. And I actually just got one yesterday that sent me something about, in Canada, they're pushing to, well, some people are pushing politically to allow minors the right to assisted suicide, which is a very fascinating idea. And it was presented to me as like gotcha, you would have to accept this if you accept trans rights for children, and obviously this is bad. And I think I'm not going to answer that question right now. First, we'll give our argument. We'll come back to it. But this is a good little introduction. So should children or minors have any say in their medical autonomy, even if it means like transgender care or even assisted suicide, which is kind of interesting. Big can of worms. But
yeah, although that one's a can of worms, whether it's a minor or an adult, so it doesn't matter. So what if we just look at kind of a basic argument setup? When we talked about this problem last semester for our ethics bowl, we tried to formulate it kind of like this. So first, you got to ask yourself the question, are minors people? And people obviously is a complicated term to try to come to grips with. But I think that by and large, this question still makes sense of the greater part of the issue. So, first is the way in which we don't think that minors are people. And people take these arguments very seriously. I'm not trying to just throw them out of hand. The idea is that minors don't have the same kind of executive control, is one way of putting it. And so they, because they aren't able to act on their rational conception of the world, so that's the executive control, is rational control. We have different kinds of controls in us. We've got a sort of just emotional control, you might call it. These are very
teenagers
loose.
Are great at.
Yeah. These are very loose terms, but basically we've got the sort of emotional responses and rational responses, and everyone, children, adults, teenagers, act on emotional responses. We start out with those, but your rational response gets more and more control as your frontal lobe develops until like the age of 25. So notably, children don't have as much rational control. Okay. Now, and you might think of humans as inherently rational creatures.
A lot of people have formulated it this way, particularly in philosophy. Like the oldest conceptions of what humans are related to rationality. Nowadays, we kind of reject most of those because we think they're overly simplistic and have been used against populations. And yeah, it's anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of, I mean, that's a big part of where we think people are failing to understand the medical autonomy question, or just generally the minor autonomy question. Because the fact of the matter is, we don't make choices like, I want to present as a different gender based off of rationale. And I just need to let that sink in for a second, because this might be hard for some people to grasp, but really think about it. This is not a rational process. It doesn't matter if you're an adult or child, teenager. You don't think to yourself, it would be rational for me to act a different way. No, you just have a feeling. And so at its base, I think the simplest way of putting the argument is that the thing that children lack, the most important thing, we could also talk about children lacking experience, which can be significant, but that's hard to argue for because they do have lots of experience. It's just different kinds of experiences. And so I think the main thing that they lack in personhood is this rational kind of override. And insofar as the actual impetus for these important autonomy kind of questions are not mainly rational, but are in fact just connected to the deep kind of emotional value that they just feel, just like everyone just feels, then it doesn't make sense to not value or appreciate that response just as much as you would as an adult. Now, here's the first objection that you've got to address and take seriously, which is somebody's going to listen to that and they're going to say, but wait, the rationality is important here because that helps you to understand consequences.
Yes.
Right? Because how do I know that this is really how I feel and what I want for my life? The funny thing is, this argument has never made sense to me as far as trans rights go. Because they're like, for teenagers, it's almost entirely reversible. We don't have doctors like giving treatments to teenagers by and large, who are giving treatments that can't be reversed. Like that, people have been saying this for a long time. They have explicitly been pointing out, look, we're not just like saying a kid walks up to you and they're like, I really want to be a different gender, and then the doctor's like, well, whoop-de-doo for you, we're going to just like we're going to put you so far down the consequence road that there's nothing that you're going to be able to do about it if you change your mind in the future. So that's point number one, is that doctors are far more responsible than that argument makes it sound like they are.
Like, put it in perspective. Any other medication, period, are they like, okay, we're just going to start you on the highest dose? Like, it doesn't happen. Usually doctors are a lot more careful because they know this type of thing, any type of thing in medicine. Like, this isn't just trans stuff. It, like, any type of procedure is usually something that, like, you ease your way into because you're not sure. Like, even if you were like really, really aware of consequences, you still aren't aware of the consequences for anything in the medical field very well. So it's like we have a careful approach when it comes to transitions of any kind. This is just another one of them.
Yep. So I don't think that argument holds a lot of water. And there is another response, which I think is even more powerful and meaningful, which is that people, so I'm using people here to refer to minors and adults. Although we do prize our rationality, and I might say it's important that I understand the consequences of important decisions so that I don't make mistakes in the future. Just pause and think about that for a second in terms of adults. Do adults make mistakes that they wildly regret in the future?
All the time.
This makes it sound like adults are these like these paragons of rational action, that we just like, we understand what's going to occur in our lives so much that I'm only ever going to make a decision if I'm just positive about it. And I'm not trying to discount the fact that there is a difference in executive action capacity between teenagers and adults. But what I want to challenge is the idea that somehow there's asymmetry of rationale, because I don't think that's actually the case. Let me put it this way. Teenager says, I feel like a girl. And they have lots of reasons for this, right? They're not devoid of rationale in this calculus, okay? What you're really worried about when you say, I'm not sure we should just let them have their own autonomy on this issue, is you're worried that they will make the decision rashly, right? In other words, we're not questioning their feelings because that's stupid. We're not questioning their reasons, not directly. We're questioning their quickness to act on it. So I would even challenge the rationale approach, that it's actually about the executive action of being able to keep everything, all of the reasons and the emotions and the consequences together at the same time, and then make a decision based off of all of those. Because we know that teenagers are really bad at that.
Yes.
They're bad about being rash. Totally valid. But guess what? No one lets a teenager make this decision rashly. I'm sorry, but that's just like, think about that for 2 seconds, okay? No doctor is just like, oh, you want this? Well, we're just going to immediately start you on this without asking you any further questions or giving you any time period to think about this. Okay, that's one thing. And the other thing is, kids, it's hard enough to do this that kids don't act like that. They don't just one day say, this is how I feel, and then that same day do something about it. That's a rash decision. No. Normally, it's a process of years that they're thinking about this until they decide this really is a big enough deal that I'm willing to risk my social standing, risk my relationships to confront it. So in other words, I don't think the rationale argument works. We're certainly not different emotionally. And I don't think it can be based rationally, especially as far as the trans rights go.
I also would like to just point out that like rash decisions are something we're all capable of. Now, it is very clear that like teenagers are exceptionally more likely to make rash decisions, but because of the fact that all of us make rash decisions, the system is set up to make it so that you can't make rash decisions. Even for an adult, like if you were to go and like just out of nowhere pursue something without reasons or without any real thought or consideration, most doctors would refuse you. And that's because they recognize that you're making a rash decision. That same type of thing is going on here. If there were a child that for some wild reason was like, I now am hyperfixating on this and I want this right now. Those same systems would come into effect.
Yep. And of course, you know, if we just took the process seriously and we didn't have to make all these careful arguments, you'd see that what it normally looks like is a kid will say, look, this is how I feel. And the parent will talk to them for a while. And then they will initiate a period of social transition where nothing about their body is nothing, no change. And all they do is they start dressing differently and changing their appearance. And normally social transitions last for a while. And either the kid says, yes, this is what I want, or they have a good long period to say, this is not what I want. So again, it's just not even how it works in practice. And so I think that the fear that's coming out in this whole conversation is actually a fear based in the idea that it's like the potential for a mistake is so high that you are basically just making the calculus that you don't think it's not a risk worth
trying to mitigate.
Yeah, exactly. And to that, I would say, go talk to a trans person. Like you just don't know what you're talking about. The benefit for somebody who feels this way far outweighs any cost that you're imagining up in your mind.
Yeah. I would also like to just point out that part of the reason why I care about this issue so much is because of this experience. Because I definitely grew up and was the type of person that was like all against it forever. And I was very, very certain about that. And then just because of the community that I then became a part of at college, I started running into people who had been through this process. And I was absolutely dumbfounded by how different it was than what I was absolutely certain it was. And how actually reasonable and totally fine it was. Like, I'm not saying there isn't any potential for things to be done poorly, but I don't think it's anything special either. I think that like, yeah, things are handled poorly for children all the time, but never it's never in relation to like, this isn't going to be a particularly bad case. In fact, the fact that it is so serious will make this more of a careful case, one that is taken more seriously and one that is handled better. I think you're more likely to get fricked up by your parents in relation to the little things they tell you about particular groups of people than you are going to get fricked up by your parents telling you that it's okay that you're wearing a dress right now.
Amen to that. Yeah. And do you think it'd be fair to say that what we're really trying to argue is that the potential danger of transitioning is a danger that everyone shares basically equally, that it is not significantly different between teenagers and adults?
Mm-hmm. This is one way of illustrating this point that I think is useful. So if we were to ask ourselves, what do we think a good decision-making process for this type of decision would look like? Because we have to admit that there is at least some ideal situation in which we are okay with it, at least. Maybe it's bad across the board, but I don't really have much to say to you if that's you. Like, seriously. But let's say that there is an ideal situation in which you make this decision, or just decisions in general, Now, if you were to go to that ideal person, how would you determine whether or not they were in that situation? You would ask them questions, you'd ask them about their reasons, you'd ask them about how they feel, you'd ask them about what their big picture for this event in their life was like. And what is fascinating is that you can ask those exact same questions to a teenager and get reliable answers. The only question that you can ask a teenager that you probably won't get a reliable answer to is the totalizing one, where it's like, do you have a picture of how your life is as a whole,
Yeah.
or the whole of how society is working, or what this is going to do? That's the only question in which we can't be confident that their answers are legitimate. Because again, if they provide feelings or emotions, they're just as reliable about their emotions as we are, sometimes they're more so, actually.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
they're more
actually.
upfront in their mind. But then if you were to ask them their reasons, they provide reasons, and we don't measure reasons based off of people. We measure them off of their own characteristics, the reasons themselves. And so the only thing that like is different is that if you ask them, totalizing claims about like the world as a whole, or their world as a whole, that's the ones where like maybe you haven't explored it enough. But again, that is not the make or break in this, because it isn't a from here to the next moment we're changing everything. It's not a dramatic shift. So I don't know if that makes sense, or if you have a clarification to add, but
No, that made sense to me. Maybe it doesn't make sense to other people. If so, listening in, I suppose. I think it has been covered from the angles that I wanted to cover it on. And just to kind of round out the minor conversation, we'll just touch on this issue of suicide, because I don't
Yes.
particularly care to just not talk about things.
I actually have a comment here.
Okay.
This I set myself up for this. So the suicide question is an incredibly difficult one. We've already pointed this out. Whether or not minors have access to certain things is a tricky question itself, but then to take that to the superlative, to like suicide, is very, very scary, and it really is going to strain this argument. But I would like to point out that the calculus that you do in light of our argument is actually remarkably simple, which is, I don't know who you are, whoever is listening to this. How do you feel about assisted suicide? What is the situation in which you feel like assisted suicide is okay or not? Maybe you don't think it's okay at all, and in that case, no minor should be doing it. But maybe you think there are situations in which it is like permissible and okay. And then the conclusion here is that if you can get to the point where you're confident that a minor is also in that situation, then it becomes okay. Now, I'm not saying that it is or it isn't. We haven't discussed the issue at all. I'm just pointing out that the calculus becomes identical.
Yeah.
You look for the type of situation in which the decision can and should be made. And then if you can show that a minor can fit that situation, then you treat them as equals in regard to that decision.
In other words, the symmetry between the lives of adults and minors is far greater than I think society at large gives it. Like, they aren't a subspecies. As we've tried to point out, they just lack very particular kinds of capacities and experiences.
And maybe you think that those capacities are relevant for the question of suicide particularly. I personally do to some extent. But that's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah. No, I could definitely see that being relevant. That would narrow the window of when you think a teenager per se has met the relevant
yes.
quota.
But again, it's not because they're a minor.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, that is not the defeater here. The defeater here is that we know what it looks like for a good decision to be made in regard to a certain thing, and that they're not meeting that criteria. But that criteria isn't their age.
Yeah, exactly. And we're just, frankly, that is what ageism is. This is the definition of ageism that we're trying to point out, is that you're using age as a correlate to these other relevant factors. and then treating age as if it is directly relevant when it obviously isn't.
Just a correlate.
It's just a correlate. And we've talked about this with old people as well. The exact same thing applies. Age is just a correlate. You don't know somebody's capacity because of their age. You just can say it's more statistically likely that they will have a particular capacity. But to use their age as the measurement is ageist because it doesn't make sense.
And I would also like to point out it's stupid. Because like just take it to some slight extreme and you'll see how ridiculous it gets. So like, for example, is age a correlate with blindness? Yes, it is. It is 100% a correlate with blindness. You are more likely to be blind when you're older. Older people do get blind, or at least vision impairment. Now, would it be ridiculous for me to say that because you're old, you're blind? Yes, it would be ridiculous.
That's perfect.
How could we figure out whether or not you're blind? We could just test whether or not you're blind. That's how we should be doing it. The same type of calculus is going on with minors, where we're like, we know how we test whether or not it's a good decision. Age isn't the factor that is important. It's correlated to the factors that are important, but it isn't the factor itself.
Yeah, no, it's kind of silly when you really sit down and think about it, and you're like, oh, I've just been using age as a heuristic to be able to think about like what autonomy means, but it just breaks down so quickly, and you're like, well, of course, yeah, autonomy is something that has meaning in its direct relative, attributes.
Which, for those who don't know what heuristic means, because I've been brought face to face with the fact that I use this word and other people don't know what it means all the time. Heuristic is very similar to a correlative, but specifically it's the act of using something that's correlated to gather information. So, for example, if you were to I don't know, do you have a good example off the top of your head?
We use like the heuristic of time and that's a really deep one. Why did I choose that one?
The most difficult one.
It's because my brain's on time all the time.
Oh, this is a good one. We use texture, how things appear to us, as a heuristic for how they feel. So we look at something and say, that feels hard, even though we haven't felt it yet. Now, this is a good heuristic because they're usually correlated, but have you ever seen something that like looked like a certain way and then you touch it and it really surprises you? That's your heuristic breaking down. You were using sight as a heuristic for touch. But these can be even like social things are a great example of this because we use heuristics to run society. So, for example, your degree is frequently used as a heuristic for your ability. Whether or not you have a degree is supposed to correlate to whether or not you are capable to do a certain thing. Those aren't necessarily connected. There are people who have degrees that don't know what they're doing, and there's people who don't have degrees that do know what they're doing. But we as a society have started using degrees as a heuristic for your ability to operate in a certain way. We probably have more.
That's a really interesting thought. Yeah. I like that one.
Heuristics are everywhere. The more you look, you'll see them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty much the whole conversation on minors. I think we also have talked a lot about how minors are educated, I suppose would be the only other side of that. And we have a little bit more time, so maybe we'll just throw that in with the rest of the minor.
I have a specific thought here. So there's another concern when it comes to trans rights specifically for minors. And you will hear this all the time if you're listening to particular types of talk shows. I won't classify them because I think that's kind of ridiculous to put them all under one umbrella. They're all very different in their own way. But the argument goes as follows, that, you know what, we should be concerned because none of the adults in a child's life are going to help them make good decisions, and that their parents are going to try and force certain things upon them. Mm. Now, what's fascinating about this argument, the argument that says basically your parents will try to make you trans, is that it brings us face to face with the question of how educating children and the responsibility to raise children is related to the adults in their lives. Do you see kind of where I'm going with this?
I think so.
So another great example is in the education system right now, what a child is taught is a very big topic of controversy. And right now, this is how the discussion goes. You look at the thing that they're being taught and you decide whether or not it's one of those things where we let the parents decide whether or not it's something that they should be taught, or whether or not society gets to decide whether or not it's something that they should be taught. So like your common core is the type of thing that society has said, look, children need to be taught this whether or not you as their parent want it. But then sex education is the type of thing where it doesn't matter what the government thinks, at least here in Utah. Your parent gets to decide whether or not you get a particular type of sex education. What's fascinating, though, is that those two positions fighting against each other completely ignores the most important person in this discussion, the child.
Yeah.
The person who's being educated. And I think that leads into where you might have been wanting to take this.
No, it's an excellent introduction, because fundamentally, you're just not treating the child as a person. You're not treating them as somebody who has any relevant say in the conversation, any important opinions to share. And you might be like, well, of course they don't have important opinions because they don't know. That's the whole point, is we're trying to decide what to teach them. And I just want to say, hold up for a second. What is it that children know? And we would like to argue that the one thing that that you can be sure that children do know is what they care about. And the reason I can tell you that you can be sure about this is because you can't tell them what to care about. Give them all the education you want. It doesn't matter. You will never be able to change their mind about what they care about. This story is as old as time itself. The child who was the son of a banker, who loved his job, and he wants his son to take on the family business.
And then he wants to be a dancer or something.
Yeah, exactly. It does, like, it's insane to think that children are these just blank slates, that it only matters what you write on them. And if we can control what it is that we write on these blank slates, then we get to control who they are. Because if I put it like that, hopefully you can just see how blind of an endeavor that is. Given that it's blind, I think we should realize that it matters far less what content we are feeding children. This will affect them. It can be noted that children develop in slightly different ways depending on what information you give them at different times. But you can't actually control their overall development. Doesn't matter which field we're talking about. Let's use sex education as an example. You can have somebody who's sexually developed in a cognitive sense at a younger age than another person, and you are not going to be able to predict from there that one or the other child is going to end up being any particular kind of sexual adult. Because the fact of the matter is, development is a complicated set of paths that fascinatingly ends up leading to a very similar spot. In other words, you're just getting people to adulthood or mature, educated standing. And although it can, it's not like it's useless to try and help people to navigate that in what we might call a less traumatic way. I'm all for that. But even those who went on the more traumatic route,
who didn't have education for their entire upbringing, do they end up being uneducated adults? Maybe in particular metrics that are kind of stupid usually, but overall they end up being mature and able to understand their world, whatever world that may be. So the point here being that, like, right now we are literally, fighting each other over this question of who gets to decide what we push on to children in order to make them educated adults. But it doesn't seem to me, at least, that we've illustrated that we couldn't let them be the determining force in their own education.
Yeah.
And if we did that, then we wouldn't have to fight over it because they would be persons that are in charge of themselves.
And yeah, that might be a hard pill for some people to swallow, but if it is, I would just say back up for a second and take, really give some thought to the idea of, as much as you might like to be in control of what kind of a person your child ends up being, do you really think that you have that control in the first place? Do you really? Are you the determiner of your child's values, of their should you be? Like, that's kind of a rather manipulative position to try and take. Like, people are just going to run into information. You trying to control information is really just you trying to define what particular path some child is going to take to adulthood. But the fact of the matter is, there are many paths to adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the more important part. In restricting the path that you think might be the best one to get there, you very well could be going against or hindering your child from pursuing what they actually care about. So in other words, what we would think is certainly a better overall way of approaching this is to, instead of saying, look, kid, the only thing that we care about is your ability to be a tool,
to do arithmetic.
Yeah, to do arithmetic, your utility value. And so you need to be a good tool, and we're going to show you the ways in which you can learn to do that. And then later on, the kid grows up and they're like, wait a second, I don't care about being a tool. And we're like, oh yeah, no one actually cares about being a tool. Like, that's just kind of like what society tells us. So and then like no one has any answers, and the kid's like, what? Why?
Then they're mad at society and they become a Marxist. So if that's what you're worried about, which there's usually a correlation between like helicopter parents and hatred of Marxism, which is fascinating. Just saying.
It's very true.
I would also like to point something out here, which is, if I don't just lose the thought as it enters my mind. Let me think about it for a second.
Okay.
Continue. Yeah.
So the other half of that conversation is, well, then what would it look like? And the answer is simply, well, the kid is like, let's say, wow, I really like stars. So this is a good example with you. I want to study astronomy. And you're just like, cool, here's a telescope. Yeah, and in other words, education is the facilitation of the pursuit of values that are presented. And this is a good example with you. I didn't even think of that in the beginning because this is what you did, right?
Yeah, literally.
And so for like a long time, you were very, very familiar with astronomy. It was like your whole life.
To paint this picture, I'm like 8 years old. I can like barely read, but I'm trying to read textbooks on astronomy. And like probably what you would call grossly undereducated in most other aspects of life. I didn't know hardly any math. I didn't know hardly any history. I wasn't getting the formal education because my family was homeschooled and I was a middle child of a dozen. So, but like I was quite interested in astronomy.
And then, are you an astronomer now?
Nope, I'm not.
No.
And surprisingly enough, I'm pretty good at math, history, and the other things because after feeling like I didn't like astronomy anymore, I went and found something new. And along the way, I ended up learning math and learning English and all this stuff. And yeah, maybe my grammar suffered a little bit, but we can't decide whether or not that's my upbringing or dyslexia. So...
But yeah, the point is, and this is a theory of mine. This would be my philosophy of education take, which is that when we are educating, content is irrelevant. 100,000% content is completely irrelevant to the actual endeavor. The endeavor is simple. We want kids to learn how to learn.
Mhm.
And that is it. Because as an adult, nothing is more important than just knowing how to teach yourself something.
Yes.
That's it. And once you have that ability, you can do whatever you want. And what I find so funny is, why aren't we just letting children do what they want, and through that process learn how to learn? Because guess what? Children don't even need encouragement to learn.
They love it.
We're natural learners. And most kids, if you talk to them and they're like, man, I did so bad in school. You're like, man, it was such a struggle for me. And then instead of asking more questions about school, you ask them, well, like, what do you like? And what things have you taught yourself? They're going to have just as many answers to that question as the kid who was really good in school. Everyone has a bunch of things that they're really interested in learning, and they just naturally teach it to themselves because that's what we do. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, kids who really don't want to learn the things that school is telling them to learn are suffering because we are basically telling them that they're a failure for just happening to be different.
Yeah. Now, I'm basically just going to do objections here. So I talked to my brother about this concept. I kind of presented this whole thing, and he's a dad, which I think also is an important caveat for us. We are not parents.
We do not have children.
But we both have lots of little siblings, and we worked with and in education. So we're around that type of environment. Maybe not as much as a lot of other people. There are definitely people more educated on the subject than us. So don't take this to be us being like, here's our authority. It just is relevant to what we were talking about. But in the conversation, there was this concern which was like, look, if I do not, direct the education of my children, or children in an education system, then they'll essentially end up aimless scrolling through TikTok. Which I think is a legitimate concern, and it may be something that like you were thinking yourself, because we do have this image in our heads of children who are not doing anything and like not progressing, because that is a thing that happens. Here's the two notes there. Number one is that when we say that you should let them direct at their own education, we're not saying that your job is over. Like, again, creating the environment that facilitates this is incredibly important. And part of that environment is going to include you controlling some of their aspirations, per se. Like, one of the things that can blind a child and restrict their access to the things they care about is just a hyperfixation on one particular thing. And if you don't step in and say, hey, we want to give you some new experience, so we're going to drag you along to the aquarium or something like that. If you don't do that, then they can get caught in a cycle that doesn't lead them somewhere good. But that isn't you telling them that they have to be a particular way. It's just you giving them an environment full of experiences that makes them run up against the things they might care about. And then in regards to TikTok specifically, or media in general, I think this type of question looks different when you admit to yourself that social media is just manipulation. Like, you letting your kids be on TikTok isn't you being like, I'll let you decide your own life. It's you being like, here, TikTok, you can control this person. So it's not free reign to let your kids be a part of manipulative systems. So like, if you're like, I really feel like I should just stop my kids from participating in these particular types of things, yeah, pull your kids out of those things. But again, it isn't you telling them that they need to be educated in a certain way or follow a certain path. It's just you trying to put them in an environment that facilitates them pursuing what they care about. That's the end of the story.
Yeah. I 100% agree. Yeah. And I would tack on that I think I wouldn't necessarily, and you might have a different answer to this, I wouldn't necessarily advocate for homeschooling either. And my reason for that is simply that, one, it's not a great way to encourage a variety of experience, which we've been trying to point out is important. Like, part of discovering what you care about is finding things to care about. And so you've got to run into a bunch of stuff, and homeschooling tends to subdue that a bit.
A little bit more isolated in some ways.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to point out is that social education is the sort of thing that occurs by just being around a bunch of people. And like, that is the only requirement, and it's the only way to successfully do it. Yes. And so I also think that you're kind of doing, and don't hate me, but I think you're kind of doing your kids a bit of a disservice to homeschool them in that regard.
I have a few things to note here. Number one is it possible to do homeschooling in a way that does give them enough experience and presents them with enough social interaction to facilitate that? Absolutely, 100%. It's just difficult.
That's a good point.
It takes more effort, more time to actually make sure that they have the available experiences and are running up against things they might care about. And it takes more time to like find people for them to interact with, because your school isn't providing that. Can you do it? And would it be great? Probably, actually.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. Yeah.
The other thing is that there are certain things in society, very limited things, like a ridiculously small amount of things, that everyone does care about in a certain way. One of those is an ability to interact with other people successfully. And that just comes to the fact that we are social creatures to some extent. Even if you're introverted, you do want to have a certain ability to interact with other people. And so that is an example where, like, that's the sort of thing that your child's education needs to include. And in addition to that, you might think other things that are like the basic ability to like provide for themselves in a physical sense. That's another thing that, like, you don't need to question yourself if you're like, I think they need to be a little bit better at this. Because those things are like, yeah, no, they will need to run up against those and work with those. Yeah. Anyways.
Cool.
Yep.
Well, I think we have stirred enough pots. Have lots of thoughts in your head. Go talk about them. And thanks for listening.